Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. Right at that moment, no one could listen to the announcement through the speakers anymore. The plane went into chaos, with wails and screams sounding from every part of the plane. There were even some passengers demanding answers to their questions. It was Roxanne's first time experiencing such a situation as well. Although she felt uneasy, she still managed to calm herself down. Yet as she listened to what was going on around her, the uneasy feeling in her heart seemed to have grown stronger. The airplane was still experiencing turbulence. Suddenly someone cried out, "My kids are waiting for me at home." Roxanne clearly heard that sentence. Her eyes widened and the restlessness in her heart seemed to have increased greatly. "My kids? Archie and Benny are still waiting for me at home." Roxanne was already selfish enough to keep their family background a secret. She could not bear to think what would happen to them if something were to happen to her. The moment she imagined her two children ending up alone if something happened to her, her face turned as pale as a sheet. She started breathing heavily, unable to catch her breath because of her anxiety. Just when she felt she was about to pass out, a large hand tightly grabbed onto hers. Roxanne barely regained some of her senses and heard Lucian's deep voice sounding next to her ear. "Don't worry. It's just turbulence. It'll be over soon." His voice seemed to have some sort of magical power, for Roxanne was able to breathe normally again after listening to him, although her body was still trembling. When Lucian noticed Roxanne's nervous and anxious look, the anger in his heart long dissipated. On the contrary, his heart ached for her. "I'm right here. Nothing will happen to us. Don't be afraid," Lucian comforted her. Roxanne nodded absent-mindedly as she looked at the economy cabin. "Hey Archie. Benny," she muttered. Lucian had to focus in order to hear what she was saying. Roxanne was already so afraid, yet she was still thinking of her two children at home. At that moment, Lucian's resentment toward Archie and Benny's biological father increased greatly. How can he call himself a man when he left his wife to raise their kids alone? Despite his anger, he said in a low voice, "Archie and Benny are obediently waiting for you back home. You will return safely, so stop overthinking. Take deep breaths and relax." Roxanne was trying very hard to do as he said, but her body seemed to be out of her control. The other passengers did not even listen to the flight attendant's advice. It was madness out there and Roxanne was greatly affected by it. Lucian looked toward where Roxanne was gazing and realized the reason for her sudden fear. His eyes darkened. In a soft voice he said, "Don't listen to them. Listen to me. Turbulence isn't a big problem and we will be fine. They're scared because they haven't experienced it before. They also don't understand." Roxanne's attention was slowly drawn away from the chaotic mess in the economy cabin. The loud noises soon faded as well. Lucian sighed in relief when he saw that Roxanne was calming down. As it was still a mess outside, he could only continue talking to Roxanne while holding her hand tightly to give her strength. Slowly, Roxanne started to tighten her own grip around his hand. Sensing the sudden force, Lucian, too, tightened his grip around her hand. Roxanne seemed to be terrified and had grabbed onto him to release the fear in her heart, and Lucian allowed her to do just that. He was also waiting for her reaction in anticipation when she came to her senses and realized that they had been holding hands all this while. The airplane slowly regained control, but Roxanne's mind was still as blank as an empty piece of paper. It wasn't until the plane had safely landed that Roxanne slowly came to her senses. She was still fearful of whatever had happened just now. "I told you we would land safely." Lucian's words seemed to have hidden meaning in them. "Since we've finally touched down, you can let go of me now, right, Ms. Jarvis?" Roxanne was surprised. She had been so terrorized by what had happened just now that she had totally forgotten about the man sitting next to her. Wait, let him go? What is he talking about? Just as she was in a daze, something moved in her left hand. Roxanne looked down and saw that her hand was intertwined with Lucian's on the armrest. To be more accurate, it was her latching onto Lucian's hand for dear life. There were even marks of her fingernails embedded on his skin. As she had been gripping his hand so tightly that her hand had gone stiff, she did not even realize that she was holding his hand. Looking at their interlocked hands, Roxanne remained in shock for a few seconds before snapping back to reality. She instantly let go of Lucian's hand as if it burned her. Lucian chuckled lightly at her reaction, not at all surprised by it as drenched. It was after Roxanne retracted her hand that she realized that her body in a cold sweat. Her palms were also just as sweaty. At that realization, she looked at the man next to her only to see that he had gotten a tissue and was wiping his own palm slowly. It was obvious that his palm was full of her sweat as well. A wave of embarrassment washed over Roxanne. After calming down, she slowly recalled how Lucian had comforted her during the flight. It didn't matter how much she wanted to maintain a distance between them. At that moment, she couldn't help but admit how grateful she was to him. It was fortunate that he was there with her. Snapping out of her reverie, Roxanne looked at the man beside her with a serious expression on her face. "Thank you for comforting me earlier." Otherwise, she trailed off. Lucian discarded the tissue he had used to wipe the sweat and met her eyes. He instantly noticed that there was still sweat on her forehead and frowned. Roxanne, however, thought that Lucian was bothered by her attitude. She pursed her lips, suddenly at a loss for what to do. She was supposed to treat Lucian like a stranger, but he was by her side when she needed help the most. Therefore, she couldn't bring herself to put up the same cold exterior. Right then, 2 pieces of tissue appeared in front of her. "Here. Wipe the sweat off your forehead. The plane has safely landed. There's no need to be afraid anymore." Lucian's voice rang beside her. Roxanne took the tissues and wiped the sweat off her forehead. "Thank you. It was my first time experiencing something like that. I was really afraid," she said as she looked at the man in front of her. Lucian quirked an eyebrow nonchalantly. "And then? Is that how you're going to thank me?" Roxanne's eyebrows furrowed slightly as she looked at Lucian with a troubled look in her eyes. "How do you want me to thank you, Mr. Farwell?" Lucian's lips twitched when he heard how she addressed him. "I want you to stop avoiding me. Can you do that? I remember you said that we are only strangers to each other. I don't think you need to keep avoiding a stranger, Miss Jarvis." Roxanne was taken aback. She cast her gaze downward and remained silent. She was incredibly thankful to Lucian for helping her earlier. Nevertheless, she was still going to stay away from him. Lucian fell silent for a few seconds when he noticed her reaction. He then got up without any expression on his face. "Forget it if you can't do that," he said in a cold voice. With that, he got off the plane. Roxanne remained seated in her seat, watching as the man left the plane. It was a while before she slowly stood up. Just as she did, a wave of nausea hit her. It seemed to be a physical reaction after stress. Roxanne grabbed the seat in front of her to stabilize herself. Once she regained her balance, she carefully got off the plane. As she walked to the immigration gate, her entire body ached uncomfortably while her stomach lurched painfully. Upon getting inside the airport, she made a beeline to the nearest restroom. "Geez." A voice laced with annoyance rang out. A passerby was walking with their luggage when Roxanne accidentally bumped into him. Roxanne tried her best to suppress the discomfort she was feeling and hastily bowed to the man to apologize. She continued to run toward the restroom with a hand covering her mouth. Not far away, Lucian heard the commotion behind him. He instinctively turned around to see what was going on and managed to catch sight of Roxanne dashing into the restroom with her back arched. Lucian's gaze darkened when he saw that, and he quickly followed after her. Although Roxanne had been treating him very coldly, he still worried for her whenever he saw that she was in discomfort. When Roxanne rushed into the ladies' restroom, Lucian came to an abrupt halt and stood outside. With furrowed eyebrows, he listened to the sound of Roxanne puking her guts out. Roxanne supported herself against the wall, and her fingernails had already turned white from the force as she bent over to puke. She had been incredibly nervous. It didn't help that the flight was super bumpy, which led to her upset stomach. Perhaps her urge to puke had been suppressed by her anxiousness during the flight. It was only after she disembarked that the feeling of discomfort in her stomach rose again. Roxanne gradually stopped puking after a while. When she straightened her back, her vision suddenly went dark. It was fortunate that she did not end up fainting. Roxanne stayed in the restroom for a while more to recollect herself before walking out while supporting herself against the wall. "Oh, what's wrong?" Lucian's voice suddenly rang out next to her. Roxanne stopped and slowly looked up at him. She was puzzled when she noticed Lucian's worried look. "I thought he left. Why is he here? And he saw me in this wretched state again." Roxanne withdrew her hand from the wall and smiled at him. "I'm sorry for making you worry again, Mr. Farwell. I was feeling a little dizzy after the bumpy ride. I feel better now that I've puked up." Lucian stared at her suspiciously. Roxanne had just recovered from her fear and had literally puked her guts out. Her face was as pale as a sheet. Her words did not convince him at all. Although she was still feeling weak after vomiting everything, Roxanne didn't want to support herself on the wall in front of Lucian. She could only steel herself and wait for him to leave. However, Lucian did not seem to have any intention of leaving at all. "If there's nothing else, you should go back early, Mr. Farwell," Roxanne said. The man in question raised an eyebrow. "I don't think you are in the position to tell me when to leave, Ms. Jarvis." Roxanne was slightly taken aback, but she had no choice but to admit that he was right. With how he was acting, both of them would have to stay here forever if she didn't make the first move to leave. Roxanne gritted her teeth. She decided to force herself to start moving and leave. Alas, her legs did not have enough strength to support her body. She had just lifted her leg to take a step forward when she lost her balance and fell to the floor. In her panic, she reached out to hold the wall, but she grabbed onto a strong arm instead. Lucian could tell at one glance that Roxanne was putting up a tough act. When he saw that she almost fell, he stretched out his arm to catch her. And coincidentally, Roxanne's hand grabbed his. Both of them stopped and did not move an inch more. Knowing that she had accidentally exposed herself, Roxanne held Lucian's arm stiffly and calmed herself down. Then she slowly straightened her back and apologized as if nothing had happened. "I'm sorry. I missed a step." Having said that, she wanted to withdraw her hand. Lucian's eye darkened when he knew what she wanted to do. Before she could do so, he authoritatively pressed her hand on his shoulder. Roxanne was slightly taken aback by his gesture. "You're already in a bad shape. Stop acting tough in front of me." Frowning, Lucian wrapped his arm around her waist to support her. Instantly, Roxanne felt much better. Shortly after, she tried to keep her distance from him because there were too many people at the airport. She thought that their actions might cause others to misunderstand their relationship. "I do think that carrying you is easier," he muttered. When Roxanne heard that, she widened her eyes in disbelief and met his gaze. Lucian stared at her indifferently as if he was threatening her to oblige. "Go ahead and try escaping my embrace. There's only one way to find out if I'll make a huge ruckus and carry you out of the airport." The both of them were at a stalemate for several seconds. Roxanne clenched her teeth and averted her gaze. Subsequently, she relaxed her body and leaned against his arm. Cautiously and slowly, Lucian helped her toward the exit. Exiting the airport, Roxanne struggled a few times. "Thank you, Mr. Farwell. I'm fine. You can let go of me now." Lucian continued to support her and insisted, "I'll take you home." "It's okay. I can take a cab home myself." Roxanne turned him down without any hesitation. Her children knew that she had no feelings for Lucian. That was why she did not want them to spot her with him and create an unnecessary misunderstanding. However, she did not seem to have an upper hand in the current quandary she was in. She was rather exhausted and had no more energy to break free from his embrace. Left with no choice, she caved into Lucian. As expected, the latter did not let her have her way. He made her walk to the parking lot where Caden had been waiting for them. When Caden saw the duo walking out together, he was puzzled. Soon he figured out what was probably going on. It's no wonder Mr. Farwell went there personally, even though it was just a petty matter. He even stayed there for so long. "I guess I've got my answer now." Caden opened the car door and invited them into the car. Then he returned to the driver's seat. "Mr. Farwell, should I send Ms. Jarvis home first?" he asked with a smile. Lucian simply hummed in response. Roxanne furrowed her brows upon hearing Caden's question. She could sense that something was amiss. "Caden seems to be implying that Lucian and I are close." Once the engine was revved up, Roxanne leaned against the car door, trying her best to rest and regain some energy. None of them uttered a single word throughout the journey. When they arrived at an intersection near the mansion, Roxanne broke the silence. "Please drop me here. I'll walk home myself." She did not want her two children to see her coming home with Lucian. Needless to say, Caden immediately stared at the rear mirror to check on Lucian's response. Seeing the latter's blank face, Caden continued driving until he arrived at the gate of Roxanne's house. Archie and Benny dragged Madeline to the door the moment they heard some noises at the gate. They opened the door as soon as the car pulled over at the entrance. The three of them were completely baffled to see the car that stopped at the porch. "This car looks somewhat familiar." Roxanne could see the curious gazes of the trio in the car. Instantly she felt a headache coming her way. While she was still debating how to explain herself, the man next to her opened the car door. Upon recollecting herself, she wanted to open the door. Only then that she realized that it was already open. "You're home." Lucian reminded her of her predicament with an outstretched arm. Roxanne clenched her jaw and wanted to hop out of the car from another side. Lucian's voice sounded again. "I suppose you wouldn't want your two children to see you fall down, right?" Roxanne's body stiffened at once. Though she had not regained much of her strength, she did not want Archie and Benny to see her being so close to Lucian. Ultimately, she did not want to embarrass herself in front of her kids. After what seemed like forever, Roxanne decided to hold Lucian's arm as he assisted her out of the car slowly. Realization finally dawned on the two boys when they saw Lucian. "It's Daddy." It had been a while since they had last seen Lucian. They had forgotten it was his car. "I thought Mommy doesn't like Daddy? Why is she with him?" At that thought, the boys stared at Lucian warily. They were worried when they saw Roxanne being assisted by Lucian as she got down from the car. Immediately they let go of Madeline's hand and rushed over to Roxanne. Trailing behind her, they asked in a concerned tone, "Mommy, what happened to you?" Roxanne forced a smile when she saw how anxious her boys were. "I had motion sickness on the plane, but I'll be fine once I get some sleep." Madeline went up to her and shifted her gaze to Lucian. "How did it get so serious?" Roxanne shook her head and slowly stopped in her tracks. The observant Lucian noticed her action and stopped as well. "Thanks for taking me home, Mr. Farwell. I'll let you go instead of inviting you inside." Roxanne flashed him a polite yet distant smile before offering a hand to Madeline. "Help me, Madeline." Hearing that, Madeline held her hand and got hold of her. Lucian merely frowned and did not let go of her. Archie and Benny went up to him and offered to take Roxanne's hand. Faced with the two munchkins and coupled with the words uttered by Roxanne on the plane, Lucian reluctantly released his grip in the end. Archie let Benny hold their mother's hand while he turned to look at Lucian. He pulled a long face as he questioned his father. What happened to Mommy? Why are you with her?" Lucian found it amusing that the little one was interrogating him like a protective cub protecting its food. At the same time, he could not ignore the fact that Archie was wary of him. Just like Roxanne, the two boys never let their guards down when Lucian was around. "I was on the same flight as your mommy. After getting off the plane, I noticed that she was unwell. So I sent her home," Lucian explained to Archie patiently. Archie looked him in the eyes for a while. Since he could not tell if Lucian was telling a lie, he assumed it to be true. When Roxanne saw that Archie was standing very close to Lucian, she quickly called out to him, "Let's head in, Archie." The little boy nodded obediently and withdrew his gaze from Lucian. Then he followed Roxanne into the house. Madeline held her bestie carefully. "Is it true that you felt nauseous? I don't remember you having motion sickness in the past." The two ladies had known each other for years. However, it was the very first time that Madeline had heard Roxanne speak about her motion sickness, and a severe one, too. Roxanne was afraid that her condition would frighten her children. Thus she nodded lightly at them and added, "I was already unwell earlier today." With that, Madeline dropped the topic and assisted her into the mansion. Lucian stood at the gate, the emotions in his eyes unfathomable. "Ms. Jarvis, Mr. Farwell is still outside." Lisa was cooking dinner when Roxanne walked in. She noticed how feeble Roxanne was and dashed over to check on her. At one glance she could see that Lucian was still standing on their front porch. Roxanne frowned and simply gave her a laconic reply. "Shut the door, please." She had no intention of getting entangled with that man. Lisa was clueless about their affairs. She had always thought that the couple was on good terms because Lucian seemed to be very caring toward Roxanne. At one point she even had the impression that they would be together. Since Roxanne was obviously giving Lucian the cold shoulder, Lisa assumed that the two had a falling out over some issues. She felt bad when she glanced at Lucian before closing the gate. With the doors closing in front of him, Lucian retracted his gaze and returned to the car. Subsequently, he instructed Caden to send him back to the Farwell residence. Essie should be home now at this hour. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Lisa helped Madeline to walk Roxanne back to the bedroom. Archie and Benny served her a glass of hot water sweetly and nestled closely around her bed, staring at her intently. Roxanne flashed the children a comforting smile. "I'm all right. I just need to get some rest and I'll recover in no time. You two go out and play, okay?" The two of them exchanged a glance, both feeling perturbed. Madeline chimed in, "Go ahead and leave her to me." Then she signaled Lisa to usher the kids outside. Archie and Benny had no choice but to leave the bedroom reluctantly. As soon as the door was shut, Madeline put on a solemn face and bombarded her bestie with a series of questions. "You'd better come clean with me now. What happened? You were perfectly fine when you attended the banquet yesterday. How is it possible that you became so sick today? Also, did you really run into Lucian?" Roxanne felt slightly exasperated having to attend to the relentless interrogation of her best friend before she could recuperate. "It's really just a coincidence. There was a minor accident on the flight back which startled me and caused me to become like this. Don't tell the boys. I don't want them to worry. Madeline stared at her for a while. The suspicion in her eyes was replaced with sympathy. All right, I got it. I know what to do. It's just that you and Lucian. Madeline was well aware of what happened between them. 6 years ago, Roxanne had fled to a faraway place because of Lucian's hostility against her. Now that she was back, the man had been acting like a completely different person. Not only did he keep showing up around Roxanne, but his attitude toward her had also improved tremendously. Madeline could not wrap her head around the changes in Lucian. She could only pray hard that Roxanne would not let history repeat itself. Although Roxanne had repeated multiple times that she felt fine, Madeline could not feel at ease. And hence she examined her body thoroughly. In the end, she concluded that Roxanne had mild post-traumatic stress. With sufficient rest, she would surely recover. Roxanne did not want the kids to speculate, so she went downstairs after getting a short rest. Right then, Lisa was serving dinner. She was about to head upstairs and check if Roxanne wanted to join them, only to realize that Roxanne was already up. How are you feeling? Can you eat these? Otherwise, I can make you some soup. Lisa was very concerned. Roxanne's face was no longer as pale as before. She shook her head and replied, "Don't trouble yourself. I don't have much appetite anyway. I can eat anything that's already been prepared." With that, she took her seat at the dining table. Archie and Benny, who were in the living room, dashed over to surround Roxanne the moment they heard her voice. As their gazes met, Roxanne ruffled their hair. "Don't worry. I'm all good after getting a good nap." The two kids looked away. They were still downcast and their eyes were filled with concern. They had always been with Roxanne since they were young and had seen her flying everywhere for work. Thus, they knew very well that she did not have any motion sickness. They wondered what went wrong during the flight home. Seeing that both her sons were unhappy, Roxanne shot Madeline a helpless glance to request her intervention. She was in a dilemma. She could not tell her sons the truth, yet she was not in the capacity to come up with a better excuse. Upon sensing her request for help, Madeline looked at the boys and casually cleared her throat. "I've checked your mommy's condition. Thankfully, there's nothing serious that we need to worry about. She just needs some rest and she'll recover well. Do you think I would lie to you?" Archie and Benny shook their heads vigorously. Roxanne beamed in gratification when she saw how caring her little boys were. She smiled and said, "I'll drive you two to the kindergarten tomorrow." Archie and Benny froze for a second and then widened their eyes in surprise. Really? In addition to being busy at work, Roxanne had been avoiding Estella. She had not been sending the boys to kindergarten since the last time she had told Estella that they were going to migrate overseas. Archie and Benny were okay about it because they could still see Roxanne after school. However, they felt horrible whenever they saw Estella's disappointed face. Now that Roxanne said she would go to the kindergarten with them, the boys felt so happy for Estella. "Mommy is taking us to the kindergarten tomorrow. That means she'll recover by then." "Yay!" Seeing how excited the kids were, Roxanne nodded. "I'll grow a long nose like Pinocchio if I lie to you." Instantly, the boys grinned from ear to ear and started digging in. Madeline stayed back for a while after dinner. When the kids went to bed, she ensured that Roxanne was comfortably tucked in bed before getting ready to leave. "Call me if you still feel unwell tomorrow." "I'll take the boys to the kindergarten," Madeline said. Roxanne merely smiled and responded, "Okay. Sorry for troubling you again for the past 2 days." Madeline shot her a reproachful look. "Am I not their godmother? It's part of my responsibility to care for them." You, on the other hand, get a good rest and get well soon." Roxanne nodded with a smile and watched as she left. Meanwhile, Estella was sprawled on the coffee table, playing with Legos when Lucian returned to the manor. As she spent a lot of time with Archie and Benny, she was influenced by their habits and had gotten Lucian to buy her plenty of Legos. Taking into consideration that she would be playing alone, Lucian had bought her a smaller set that fitted perfectly on the coffee table. Seeing him enter, Estella glanced at the door and got to her feet to welcome him. However, all she did was stand by his side and stared at him in silence. At the sight of her, Lucian couldn't help but be reminded of Roxanne. Despite her being overwhelmed by fear on the plane, all she could think of were Archie and Benny. Little does she know that Essie is her daughter too. Holding that thought, Lucian stroked Estella's head bitterly. "Miss Jarvis," Estella called out all of a sudden. Stunned, Lucian met her gaze with a frown and gradually retracted his hand. Estella, with her lips pursed and looking upset, reached out to grab his hand and commented in a piping voice, "The smell on your hand. It belongs to Miss Jarvis." Lucian lowered his head to look at his hand. Roxanne had held his hand throughout the entire journey on the plane just now. Wrinkling her nose to take a sniff, Estella walked up to Lucian slowly and stated earnestly, "Daddy, you smell like Miss Jarvis too." Having said that, she pouted unhappily. Since Daddy is carrying Miss Jarvis' scent, they must have met each other. "I have not seen her in a very long time." Estella gave her father an angry look before storming back upstairs without a word. Puzzled by her sudden anger, Lucian hurried after her. Fuming, Estella hugged her knees as she sat on the carpet in the room. Upon hearing footsteps at the door, she quickly looked up before recovering her gaze just as swiftly. "Are you angry?" Lucian asked in a deep voice. Estella threw him a glance, then turned her head in the opposite direction in resentment. "Miss Jarvis has been avoiding me because of Daddy. But now that she has met with Daddy, she's still unwilling to see me." As Estella's father, Lucian could more or less guess what was on her mind. "You don't want Miss Jarvis to leave, no?" "I too am racking my brains to get her to stay. That's why I met up with her. I have her sent on me because she wasn't feeling well after coming back. So I sent her back after that." Estella, who was giving Lucian a dubious look, was filled with concern the moment she heard Roxanne was unwell. What happened to Miss Jarvis?" Worried that she would be traumatized by the events on the plane, Lucian said, "It's nothing, really. She's just feeling under the weather." Estella, with her lips pursed, looked at Lucian in disbelief. "I want to visit Miss Jarvis. I want to see Miss Jarvis." Lucian cocked a brow in response. "Considering Roseanne's stance, I'm afraid she doesn't want to see me again. It's just that she has a soft spot for Essie. If I take Essie along, then perhaps." Lucian curled his lips mysteriously and agreed to Estella's request. "Fine. I'll take you there tomorrow." Estella was dumbstruck. He did not expect him to agree readily. "Rest early now. You still have school tomorrow. We'll go over in the morning." Lucian tousled her hair. Only then did Estella regain her senses. Looking forward to seeing Roxanne the next day, she nodded obediently. Roxanne felt a lot better when she woke up the next morning. Recalling that she was to send the children to the kindergarten, she got up and washed up before opening the door to head downstairs. Just as she did, she was greeted by the sight of the two boys at the door. Looking forward to their mother sending them to kindergarten, the excited Archie and Benny had woken up early to wait at Roxanne's door. Their initial plan was to knock and wake her up, but they decided against it as she wasn't feeling well. Not wanting to disturb her rest, they resigned themselves to waiting outside. When Roxanne came out of her room, the boys' eyes lit up. Mommy." Roxanne stroked their heads. "Come along now. Let's have breakfast before I send you to the kindergarten." Both of them nodded as they held Roxanne's hand, one on each side of her. Every now and then, they would look up at her to ascertain if she had fully recovered. When they arrived downstairs, Lisa had already prepared breakfast. Madeline, too, was already seated at the table. At the sight of them, Madeline got to her feet and looked at Roxanne. "How are you feeling?" "A lot better." Roxanne smiled. "I'll send them to the kindergarten later." Madeline nodded in relief. "I'll head out first then." She had dropped by first thing in the morning because of her concern for Roxanne's health. Roxanne was about to invite her to stay for breakfast when Madeline said, "I've already eaten. You guys enjoy your breakfast. I'll take my leave now." Roxanne didn't insist upon hearing Madeline's words. After bidding the boys goodbye, Madeline turned and left. Subsequently, Roxanne seated the children at the dining table before attempting to serve them food. However, the two boys beat her to it by serving her breakfast and urged her in their squeaky voices, "Mommy, please dig in." Roxanne was briefly stunned, but quickly she broke into a warm smile. "Thank you, darlings." Suddenly, the doorbell rang while they were having their breakfast. Thinking that it was Madeline who had come back, Roxanne told the boys to continue eating while she went to get the door. The moment she saw who it was, Roxanne was stunned. Lucien, dressed sharply in a suit with his hair combed meticulously, was standing at the door. He was holding Estella's hand and staring at Roxanne meaningfully. As for Estella, she was looking at Roxanne blankly, her eyes filled with concern. The father and daughter stood motionless at the door. It took Roxanne a while to regain her senses. She furrowed her brows at Lucien and said, "Mr. Farwell, what are you doing here so early in the morning?" Unable to bring herself to glower at Estella, she could only confront Lucien. No sooner had she spoken than she felt her sleeve being tugged by Estella. She looked down and could see the concern brimming in Estella's eyes. When they made eye contact, Estella asked carefully, "Ms. Jarvis, are you feeling better?" Roxanne was stunned by the question. She had no idea what Estella was asking about. Noticing the confusion on Roxanne's face, Lucien explained in a deep voice, "When I came home yesterday, Essie caught your scent on me and asked about what happened. I had no choice but to tell her you weren't feeling well." Roxanne frowned slightly. "I'm fine. Why did you have to tell her?" She only didn't want Estella to worry, but the latter pouted aggrievedly, thinking that Roxanne didn't want to see her. Roxanne's words caused Lucien to cock his brow as he looked down at Estella, whose hand he was holding. Estella, visibly nervous, was hanging her head in dejection as she tightened her grip on his hand. Trailing his gaze and noticing the disappointment on Estella's face, Roxanne felt her heart melt. In the past, Estella would have jumped with joy at the sight of her. But on that day she looked apprehensive and was wary of getting close. "It must be because I told her to keep her distance before I went overseas the last time. Archie and Benny have been talking about her when they are home. She must be missing me." Roxanne sighed in her heart. She leaned closer to stroke Estella's hair before consoling her, "I'm all right. I just didn't want you to worry. Look, don't I look fine to you?" Estella, feeling the warmth from Roxanne's palm, briefly hesitated before pursing her lips and raising her head to stare at the latter. The moment their eyes met, Roxanne's tender smile brimmed with affection. Only then did Estella gradually curl her lips, albeit lacking in courage to approach Roxanne still. Seeing that Roxanne didn't return after a long while, the curious Archie and Benny went to the door to check. When they saw the two visitors at the door, both of them exchanged hesitant glances. They were delighted to see Essie but were reluctant to let Lucien come in. They felt conflicted and didn't know how to face the visitors. Mommy." After a moment's hesitation, they finally came up to Roxanne. She threw both of them a glance. "Have you finished your breakfast?" Nodding obediently, they flashed Estella a smile before giving Lucian a wary look. "Mr. Farwell, what are you doing here?" With a slight frown, Lucian replied earnestly, "It's not me. It's Essie." Estella nodded in acknowledgement, giving the brothers a pitiful stare. She could sense their hostility toward Lucian, and she didn't like it. She hoped they would like both Roxanne and Lucian just like her. Meeting Estella's sad eyes, the brothers knitted their brows in silence. Roxanne turned her attention to Estella. "Essie, have you had breakfast? Why don't you come in and join us?" Delighted by the invitation, Estella gave Roxanne a fervent nod. Roxanne stroked Estella's hair while smiling before extending her hand to the latter. With a glint in his eyes, Lucian released Estella's hand without a word and followed them into the living room. As the brothers were done with their breakfast, they sat in the living room and waited for Roxanne and Estella to finish theirs while keeping an eye on Lucian. Even though Lucian felt helpless underneath the brothers' watchful eyes, he didn't react in any way and allowed them to continue monitoring him. In the dining room, Estella, who had actually had her breakfast before coming, simply wanted to spend more time with Roxanne. During the meal, she would check on Roxanne every now and then. When she saw that the latter still looked pale, she would serve her more food out of concern. Having been cared for by the children for the entire morning, Roxanne felt touched but guilty at the same time. Despite Estella's affection for her, she had no choice but to stay away from her because of Lucian. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.